The secret food they erased. There is a crop so powerful it was deliberately erased from history because it was impossible to tax or control. This biological anomaly yields double the harvest of a potato and survives freezes that turn wheat into ice, all without you ever buying a single seed again. We didn't stop growing it because it failed. We stopped because it was a threat to the global food system. The rule breaker. A crop that refuses to follow the laws of man. It grows without permission, feeds without cost, and survives where empires starve. It is a biological anomaly that breaks every rule of modern industrial farming, yielding double the harvest of the potato, while surviving a cold that turns wheat to ice. Once you place it on the earth, you never have to buy seed again. It replants itself, returning season after season, a permanent insurance policy against the shifting whims of nature. For thousands of years, this was the ultimate guardian against famine, a silent sentry, waiting in the soil. Then, we erased it. We did not stop growing it because it failed our ancestors. We stopped growing it because it was too successful. In a world built on commerce, a crop that spreads like wildfire and requires no middleman is a threat. It cannot be patented, it cannot be controlled, and what cannot be owned cannot be sold. This is the story of the perennial that outlasted the rise and fall of nations, survived 2 world wars, and still waits beneath your feet today. You have been told that survival is expensive and that abundance is rare. The archive is about to prove otherwise. The journey begins on a cold Atlantic shore, where a French explorer is about to taste a secret that has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The archive of 1605. A French explorer stands on the edge of a new world, unaware that the dirt beneath his boots holds a treasure more valuable than gold. The year is 1605. Samuel de Champlain, the man who would help carve New France out of the wilderness, lands along the eastern shores of North America, in the region that would one day become Massachusetts. He is not met with hostility, but with the hospitality of the Algonquin people. They welcome him to a feast that will change the course of his journey. Among the dishes of game and squash is a knobby, irregular root they call kaishuk panak, or the sun root. Champlain tastes the tuber and finds himself stunned by its flavor. He records in his journal that it possesses a delicate sweetness that rivals the artichoke of Europe. He does not see a mere weed. He sees a solution to the hunger of the old world. He fills the dark, damp hold of his ship with these resilient tubers and sets sail back to France, carrying the biological blueprint of the Great Lakes and eastern woodlands across the Atlantic. This is the perennial sunflower root, a ghost crop that would soon haunt the fields of Europe. It was the foundation of a civilization the Europeans were only beginning to understand. The Earthwoman's sacrifice. But Champlain was merely a latecomer to a secret that had been guarded for millennia. Long before his ships touched the horizon, the people of the 5 nations knew that this plant was more than food. It was a gift born from the divine. Before the explorers came, there was a legend, a story of a mother, a passing, and a gift left to the living. The Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, spoke of Earthwoman, a celestial figure who descended to create the world we know. In the traditional telling, her life ended as she gave birth to twin sons, Sapling and Flint, spirits who represented the eternal balance between growth and hardship. As she was laid into the soil, the first plants began to emerge from her body, providing for the children she could no longer hold. Tobacco grew from her head, corn and beans from her breasts, and from her feet, the first sun roots pushed through the earth. This was not a crop of convenience. It was a crop of offering. To the indigenous tribes of the Atlantic coast and the Great Plains, the sun root was a sacred legacy. They recognized it as a plant that offered everything while asking for nothing. It was a bridge between the spiritual and the physical, a testament to the idea that the earth provides most for those who listen to its rhythms. The underground network. By planting a few tubers once, a community secured a harvest that would feed their descendants for generations. They understood the sunroot as a living network, a silent provider that mirrored the resilience of the people themselves. Yet, to understand why this plant was revered as a holy gift, one must look closer at its physical form. Beneath its towering height and golden crown lies a biological masterpiece of engineering and hidden wealth. Above the soil, it is a tower of gold, reaching 8 to 10 feet toward the sun, but the true power is invisible, locked away in the dark silence of the earth. While other plants focus their energy on seeds that may never sprout, this perennial builds a subterranean fortress. Beneath the crown of yellow flowers lies a massive treasure of knobby tubers, colored in shades of white, purple, and gold. Unlike the potato, which stores its energy as starch, this root stores its sweetness as inulin. This is a complex carbohydrate that acts as a natural antifreeze, allowing the plant to survive temperatures that would shatter the cells of lesser crops. The biology of this plant is a masterclass in persistence. It spreads through underground rhizomes, a network of biological veins that pulse beneath the surface. Survival in the Dakotas. These are not merely roots, they are a living archive of calories and resilience. One small patch can expand into a colony that feeds a village for a lifetime, creeping through the dirt with a quiet, unstoppable momentum. For the tribes of the Great Lakes and the eastern woodlands, this was not just a plant, it was a biological insurance policy. It did not require the tilling of fields or the intervention of man. It simply existed, waiting to be unearthed when the world above turned cold and barren. This hidden wealth would soon become the difference between life and passing for a group of desperate men. In the winter of 1805, a legend would emerge from the frozen mud of the Dakotas. The Lewis and Clark expedition is fading. The Missouri River is a frozen graveyard. The winds of the Dakotas are a whetted blade, and the party's rations have vanished into the white void of winter. Starvation is no longer a threat. It is a reality settling into their bones. But among them is Sacagawea, a woman who understands the language of the land. She does not look for berries on barren branches or game in the drifts. Instead, she looks for the mouse caches, hidden underground chambers where small rodents have gathered thousands of roots for their own survival. She digs into the frozen mud, unearthing the knobby tubers that the explorers would have walked over in their desperation. She roasts them over the fire, the scent of nuttiness and earth filling the camp as the expedition eats for the first time in days. These roots are versatile, eaten raw with the crisp texture of a water chestnut or boiled until they are as soft as butter. They are dried into a flour that can last until the spring thaw. The yield is staggering. A single acre of these plants can produce 64,000 pounds of food without a single drop of human-led irrigation. If these stories of lost wisdom matter to you, subscribe and hit the bell to preserve what the world tried to forget. The Great European Migration. This was not a luxury, it was survival in its purest form. While the men of the expedition marveled at the rescue, the sun root was already preparing for its next great journey. Across the sea, a starving continent was about to find its salvation in the holds of French ships. When the crop reached the shores of France, it found a continent on the brink of collapse. The 17th century was an era of exhausted soils and relentless famines that struck every few years like a recurring plague. While the potato was beginning to arrive from the south, it was met with deep suspicion and whispered myths. But the sunroot, arriving from the north with the French explorers, spread across the countryside like a silent salvation. The French called it topinambour, while the Italians named it girasole, the sunflower. It was a miracle of the commons, feeding peasants, livestock, and kings alike. It required no fertilizer and almost no care. A farmer could plant a single tuber in the spring and harvest a massive bounty by autumn, knowing that if even a fragment was left in the dark earth, a full crop would reappear the following year on its own. The victory of the System University trials conducted centuries later would confirm what the peasants already knew. This crop produced 30,000 calories per acre, easily rivaling corn, the most important grain in the world. It grew where other crops withered, turning poor dirt into a fountain of life. But even as it saved millions from the breadlines, cracks began to appear in its success. The very traits that made the plant impossible to end made it a nightmare for the systems of order that were beginning to take hold of Europe. The battle for the future of the farm was about to begin. By the mid-17th century, a war was fought in the mud of European farms. The sunroot lost. It did not fall because it was weak, but because it was difficult to tax. As the modern world emerged, it demanded a specific kind of order that this perennial refused to provide. The tubers were small and irregular, a nightmare for the early machines that required uniformity. They spoiled quickly in the open air, refusing to sit quietly in the massive warehouses of the merchant class. And then there was the problem of the inulin, which caused digestive turbulence in a population unaccustomed to such potent, primal fiber. By the mid-1800s, the potato had won the war of the fields. It was larger and easier to store, fitting perfectly into the industrial systems Europe had built: the markets, the transport networks, and the tax collectors. The sunroot was demoted, reduced to a food for the poor and a supplement for livestock, a crop for those with nothing better. In North America, the settlers went further, labeling the native plant a weed. They preferred crops that required buying new seed every year, crops that could be controlled and commodified. The sunroot retreated to the ditches, waiting in the silence. The blockade and the turnip winter. But the systems of man are fragile, and when the gears of industry finally ground to a halt, the world would have to go digging in the dirt once more. World War I. Germany is strangled. The British blockade has cut the throat of the Atlantic trade, and the soil of Central Europe has turned to a gray, exhausted dust. By the winter of 1916, the mechanisms of modern agriculture had collapsed. This became the infamous turnip winter. The potato crops, vulnerable to blight and requiring intense labor, failed utterly. People were forced to eat fibrous rutabagas intended for cattle. But in the overgrown ditches and the edges of forgotten fields, a silent survivor was watching. The sunroot could not be blockaded. It could not be seized by naval fleets or destroyed by the disruption of seed supplies. While the formal economy of food evaporated, the tubers remained tucked safely beneath the frost line, waiting for desperate hands to find them. In the regions where they still grew wild, they became a secret lifeline, a source of calories that required no permission from the state to exist. They were the invisible resistance, a crop that thrived on neglect, while the empires of Europe bled themselves dry. The occupation, scraps. The First World War was a test of endurance. The second would be a descent into darkness. 20 years later, the plant would be called upon again, not just as a supplement, but as the only thing standing between a generation and the end. 1940. Occupying boots marched through Paris. The occupying forces seized 80% of all food produced on French soil, diverting every viable potato to the soldiers. What remained for the French families were the scraps the invaders deemed worthless: rutabagas and the topinambur. For years, millions survived on the very vegetable once reserved for pigs. The sunroot became a symbol of the occupation. Eaten every day out of sheer necessity, they caused the terrible digestive distress that earned them a reputation for misery. Yet, while the hunger plan successfully drained the occupied lands of their traditional wealth, this perennial refused to be conquered. It was too hardy and too persistent to be controlled by a ledger or a weapon. It simply grew in the gardens of the defiant, keeping children alive when everything else had been stolen. It was the food of the resistance, a subterranean ally that the occupiers could not effectively tax or seize. The winter of tulips and tubers. But as the war dragged into its final, most brutal winter, the struggle for food shifted to the frozen dikes of the north. The Netherlands, 1944, the hunger winter. 22,000 people are failing as the gears of civilization grind to a halt. The ground is frozen iron. In this desolate silence, the government publishes emergency cookbooks, grim manuals for a population on the verge of perishing. They list wild plants, tulip bulbs, and the sunroot as the final line of defense. Mothers and children dig into the permafrost with their bare hands, searching for the tubers that refuse to rot even in the heart of a Dutch winter. But survival leaves a scar. After the liberation, the survivors turned, their backs on the plant that had saved them. An entire generation associated the sunroot with loss, with the stench of occupation, and with the most desperate years humanity had ever seen. In France, grandparents refused to allow the topinambur on their tables, a silent vow of never again. The vegetable that kept millions of hearts beating became a symbol of suffering, discarded and forgotten. Yet, while human memory is fragile, the biological truth remains unchanged. Beneath the weight of trauma, a nutritional powerhouse waited for science to catch up to the dirt. The alchemy of inulin. Forget the myths. Look at the chemistry. Inside these knobby roots is a fuel the modern body has forgotten how to burn. The reason you haven't heard of this isn't because it's a weed. It's because its molecular structure is a direct threat to industrial control over our health. While the world spent decades chasing empty starch, this plant was quietly perfecting a profile that rivals any superfood. Every 100 grams floods the body with 73 calories, 2 grams of protein, and a staggering 429 milligrams of potassium, more than a banana. The true power lies in a compound called inulin. Comprising 50 to 60% of the plant's weight, inulin is one of the richest prebiotic sources on Earth. It passes through the stomach undigested, reaching the colon where beneficial bacteria feast upon it. These microbes multiply, producing short-chain fatty acids that lower pH levels and block pathogens. Unlike the potato, which causes a rapid spike in blood sugar, the sun choke, as it is now known, converts to energy slowly, providing a steady burn. In the 1980s, those with blood sugar concerns claimed that daily consumption of these roots dropped their medicinal needs by half. The California rebranding. This is more than a plant. It heals the very earth it inhabits. 1960. A produce wholesaler in California looks at a pile of dusty, ugly roots and sees a marketing disaster. The name was a linguistic accident, a corruption of the Italian word girasole. Frida Kaplan realized that the plant's greatest enemy was its own identity. In 1980, she trademarked a new name to strip away the confusion, the sun choke. She began packaging the tubers in 1-pound bags, including recipes that taught a disconnected public how to handle their rugged, primal texture. The result was an explosion of interest, with sales jumping 600% almost overnight. High-end chefs discovered the tuber's secret profile: nutty, sweet, and crisp. It was a reclamation of flavor, a sign that the sunchoke could move from the survival gardens of the past to the white tablecloths of the future. But while it was finding its way into the kitchens of the wealthy, a far more desperate movement was forming in the heartland. In the shadow of a failing economy, the plant was about to become a tool of independence for the American farmer. The failed revolution. The 1980s farm crisis was devastating. Across the Midwest, farms were collapsing under corporate debt. In the shadow of this ruin, farmers looked toward the sunchoke as a vehicle for total independence. It was the perfect candidate for a revolution: high yields, perennial growth, and the ability to be fermented into ethanol fuel. It promised a world where a farmer could grow their own food, feed, and fuel without writing a check to a conglomerate. This movement aimed to sever the chains of a system that demanded constant inputs. The revolution stalled because there was no market and no processing infrastructure to support it. The industrial complex had already paved over the paths that lead to small-scale sovereignty. Farmers lost money, and the sunchoke was once again cast aside as a failed dream. Yet, the idea refused to end. While the corporate experiments failed, the plant was winning the war by simply existing. In France, a new generation of chefs began to reclaim the topinambaur as heritage, calling it the forgotten vegetable. The plant was merely waiting for a world that understood the true value of resilience, the architecture of control. Why don't we see it everywhere? Because industrial agriculture demands a perfection that nature refuses to provide. The modern system is built on uniformity, prioritizing crops that ripen on a rigid schedule and ship without bruising. The sunchoke refuses to comply. It matures at its own pace, and its thin skin spoils quickly once removed from the earth. There is also the problem of the inulin. The very thing that makes it a nutritional masterpiece also causes a digestive adaptation period. We live in an era of instant satisfaction, where food is stripped of complexity so it can be consumed without thought. Even the legendary Julia Child once asked if growers could fix the flatulence problem. The answer was simple: cook it longer or allow your body a few days to adjust. But industrial food has no time for the patience of our ancestors. So the sunchoke remains niche, a plant for home gardens where it is allowed to spread uncontrollably. That spread is exactly why it is feared. In Europe, they call it invasive, a word we use for things that succeed without our permission. We are about to learn that in a world of coming chaos, the things we cannot control are the only things that will save us. The resilience vault. Climate change is ending the era of stability. The crops that feed 8 billion people were bred for a world of predictable rains, a world that is rapidly vanishing. As extreme temperatures break the back of industrial agriculture, the sunchoke stands as a silent sentinel. It was designed for extremes that would turn a modern cornfield into a wasteland. It stores its energy deep, where the drought cannot reach, and survives the deep freeze that ends the potato. This plant teaches us what empires have tried to bury. Abundance does not require total control. The sunchoke returns without permission, demanding no seed purchases and no corporate approval. It has been ready for 4 centuries, waiting in the gardens of occupied France and the frozen dikes of the Netherlands. We did not lose this knowledge, we simply chose to forget it in exchange for the illusion of convenience. But forgetting is not final. The vault of history is deep, and the sunchoke is only the first layer of what has been hidden from us. If you believe that true independence begins with the dirt beneath your feet, like this video to help others find this archive. Subscribe and hit the bell to join us as we unearth more lost wisdom that the modern world tried to forget. The next vault opens soon. Don't be left in the dark.